Okay, a very good afternoon, everyone. We are with over 300 participants right now, so I think we can start. I wanted to first welcome you all to this webinar on ethics and integrity for AI in research. My name is Matthijs Vleugel, and I'm a scientific policy officer at ALEA, which is the European Federation of Academies of Sciences and Humanities. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. Of course, also, not at least, also on behalf of my colleagues and co-organizers from the Scientific Advice Mechanisms to the European Commission and the COARA Working Group area on Responsible Data and AI in Research Assessments. As you can see, we have a Q&A open, so if you have any questions to the panel, feel free to ask them there. If you have any technical issues, you can ask them in the chat. Please also do use the chat to say hi to each other and to contribute to a discussion there. The event is being live streamed, and the webinar will also be made available on the websites of the different organizations. I think we have an absolutely fantastic panel, and we have an amazing moderator, so I'm not going to take any more of your time. It's my great honor to introduce to you our moderator for today, Nausicaa Al-Mekki. Nausicaa is a tenure-track professor in History and Arts and Visual Culture at the University of Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona and a member of the German Young Academy. Nausicaa, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Matthijs, and welcome everybody. I'm absolutely delighted that we have such a big group of people joining. We also got a bit of a sneak preview at the type of participants that have joined us, and I'm absolutely thrilled that we have such an interdisciplinary and diverse group of people joining from all over the world. So welcome everybody. We have a webinar which has a bit of a complicated purpose. We have 4 fantastic speakers who have tremendous expertise in the field of AI. And at the same time, we want to make a webinar that is accessible to as wide an audience as possible. So how do you make sure that you have a webinar that is not scraping the surface, but at the same time is accessible enough for people who maybe are just getting into the AI debate or are daunted by it, for it to still be relevant for them? So this is what we've tried to do, and we've put a webinar together for you, which will hopefully be as relevant for somebody who uses AI every day or is even shaping actively our digital future, as well as to the proverbial postdoc who only looks at medieval manuscripts but still wants to know what this whole AI thing is really about. Can I ask the panel, just with a show of hands, who of you used AI this morning intentionally? 2 people. Great. So that already says a lot, right? That's more than half of us. We'll see how things go and how our attitude possibly changes throughout this panel. The purpose, therefore, of this webinar is to go deep and broad at the same time. We want to include everybody in this debate, and we want to look at the hidden aspects of AI and research. We want to look at the hidden problems, but also at the hidden opportunities. So what we ultimately want to do is to also empower those of you who are listening to not only be relegated to be users and critics of AI, but to shape AI together. So this is the purpose of the talk. We have 4 fantastic speakers lined up. Karen Young from the University of Birmingham and a member of the SAPIA Working Group on AI and Research. Maura Heine, chair of the ALEA Permanent Working Group on Science and Ethics. Barbara Preinsack, joining us from Austria, chair of the European Group on Ethics and Science and New Technologies. And last but not least, Frances P. Crawley, co-chair and coordinator of the COARA Working Group on Ethics and Research Integrity, and responsible for research assessment for data and artificial intelligence. We are very much, just as Matthijs said, inviting you to participate to debate via the group chat. We will try to involve your questions as much as possible. And let me tell you a little bit about the structure of today's webinar. So we will start with brief presentations from every single one of our members so that you get an insight into the latest reports, analysis, and findings that they have been doing in their respective fields and working groups. This will be approximately the first 25 minutes of the webinar, followed by 35 minutes of debates, which will be divided up into the hidden aspects as well as the hidden challenges, and finally the possible empowerment tools that we have when it comes to AI. And finally, we will have a window open for the final Q&A questions that we may not have been able to integrate into the webinar beforehand. We are going to kick off with Karen Young, who will be presenting findings from her report right now. Thank you so much, Karen. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nasika. It is a real pleasure and a privilege to be here, and it's wonderful that there are so many of you here interested in this topic, which is fraught in so many ways. I'm just going to give you a little taster of the report because obviously you can read it for yourself, but just to tell you a little bit about what we did and why we did it. Or by way of background, in terms of my disciplinary orientation, I'm a professor of law, but I also have a foot in the computer science department here at the University of Birmingham, and I have been working on the governance of new technologies for many decades, and AI for probably the last 10 years. And so I've been very involved in lots of debates about the governance of AI more generally. So if we can just turn to the motivations for the SAPEA report on the next slide. In terms of why we were asked to undertake this evidence review was a request from Margrethe Vestager, recognising that a lot of work had been going on in terms of legislation, particularly negotiations under the AI Act to ensure that AI was governed responsibly, but there hadn't been really equivalent work done within the European Union concerning the use of AI in science. And so she felt it was really important that we take a good hard look at what was going on to try and identify whether further measures were needed to promote the responsible and timely uptake of AI in scientific research in order that this might enhance the EU's innovation and prosperity. So that was the basic motivation for trying to work out what on earth was going on in the AI in research space. And this working group was convened, and it soon became apparent that once we started talking about the use of AI in research, it was unavoidable but to think about AI research, because research in the field of AI was advancing so rapidly that this was also affecting the kinds of tools that were available to researchers in both academia and in R&D in industry and other contexts. So we ended up having to focus quite a lot on AI research in order to understand the landscape in which AI was being taken up in research. And so we situate the discussion of how AI tools are being used in research within this broader landscape of AI research generally. You can read the findings and the analysis in the report itself, and I'm not going to have time to talk at any length about those kinds of things, but just a quick glimpse at these two prongs. So if we turn to the next slide, in terms of AI in research, it became quite apparent that for some disciplines, AI has been an enormous boon. And they have advanced rapidly because it has enabled tasks that were previously incredibly labor intensive and required the analysis of huge volumes of data to be automated and to be automated at scale. And this enabled really exciting discovery. But it was also true that these research tools were being taken up in the social sciences and humanities, but the take-up there was much more uneven, depending upon the discipline in question. And then we also, in addition to the potential benefits that AI was already demonstrating in relation to scientific advances in academia, it also presented a number of difficulties or risks, to use the language of risk, particularly in terms of research ethics and integrity. And a lot of these problems were attributable to some of the larger incentives that affect both AI researchers and AI research more generally. And there was a really serious problem about opacity, because tools were being used that were primarily developed in commerce for which we didn't really have access to under the hood in order to analyze what the tools were really doing and how those tools had been created. And this has knock-on effects down the line in trying to replicate and provide full transparency about the findings that have been generated in that scientific research. So that was AI in research. If we turn to thinking about research in AI, one of the really striking findings, if we can move to the next slide, was that since about 2014, industry has dominated in AI research, and it's really not difficult to identify why. It's because to really lead the field in terms of AI research, one needs enormous resource. And as a result, what we saw quite powerfully is that it's the big tech industries that have the kinds of resources, not just economic power, but access to the data, to the compute, to talented researchers, and the infrastructure and funding that enables them to develop and advance AI research relative to the sort of more poverty-stricken conditions in which we work in academia. So this was a really striking finding, and that has knock-on effects downstream when we think about the principles of research integrity that apply to scientific research, because we're so reliant on commercial tools where IP rights protect against enabling us to get right under the bonnet of those tools and evaluate the basis upon which those tools work more generally. So I just wanted to leave you with two concerns that I had coming out of this review process. And if we can just move to the next slide, one of the interesting things for me was to think about, well, who are our scientific research communities? And as an academic, when you mention scientific research, I immediately think of academia. Those of us working in universities who are, doing the kinds of things that you do in academia, that you're doing research and teaching, you're trying to generate new insight according to a set of conventions of scientific integrity, and then seek to publish it in peer-reviewed papers and other outlets. But in fact, when we think about the notion of research and the notion of research which informed this evidence review, is that research happens in a much broader context, including industry R&D. And industry R&D is important for societal progress and advancement to address social problems. And so industry research is important and beneficial and something that is to be encouraged. But what is really noticeable, at least for me as a lawyer and an ethicist, is that there's a real bifurcation in the ethical governance of these two different domains in which research happens. So if you're an academic researcher like me, you have to seek advance approval for a project that involves research into human subjects, or it includes any personal data. And there's a whole institutional framework in which the ethical integrity of my research is subject to before it can proceed. And then there are a number of norms that apply in terms of research publications and so on. But when research takes place within industry, there isn't a similar kind of institutional framework. There's the law, but the law is the same law that applies to the rest of us when we're going about our business in the private world. And yet one of the things that we see in the AI space is a lot of so-called testing. It's just out in beta. And there's a sense in which if it's just out there in beta, the law doesn't really apply to me. And let alone whether or not we have to worry about ethical governance. And so what I'm increasingly observing is that in the wild, testing of AI systems is going on in a fairly ungoverned space. Certainly it's not subject to systematic ethical governance. And we've already seen a number of quite spurious in the wild tests being done that have generated interferences with ethical norms, with legal rights, and producing evidence that, in my view, is epistemically spurious. Well, to some extent, this is somewhat mitigated by the introduction of the EU's AI Act, at least for so-called high-risk systems that are listed under Annex 3, but that's only a tiny subset of AI systems. But at least those ones will be subject to institutional approval when there is in the wild testing. But other than that, we still have a lack of systematic governance for in the wild testing when it's undertaken by industry, even when the potential risks are really quite significant. So I'm just going to leave it there, and I will look forward to your questions later. And it's back to you, Nausicaa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for that amazing summary of a very big review. I have two key takeaways from your talk so far. First of all, the question who makes research and who regulates research is quite complicated, right? So the difference between a university regulation, which might be subject both to the general laws as well as to its own more stringent codes of conduct and codes of ethical practice, creates a system that might be quite stringent. And then if we go outside to industry, we see lots of playing around better, things that really apply to us. We are not considered high risk, so we can do whatever we want. So you can see sort of when it comes to research, there are two sort of spheres or two worlds of research with wildly different regulations. And even though the current AI Act does have some provisions for it, many big industry players do not apply as high risk, meaning that they are only asked to self-regulate and self-assess. So thank you so much for explaining that, because I think a lot of people tend to assume that research is by default academic. I have fallen into that pitfall as well as a humanities person, but since 2014, research has shifted increasingly towards industry, and it has no sign of stopping. So thank you so much for also making us mindful of the fact that research is also happening in industry, but according to very different conditions than what is happening at universities. Thank you so much, Karen. And I'm going to give the virtual floor, to Maura Heine, Chair of the ALEA Permanent Working Group on Science and Ethics. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And it's a real honor to be here. I suppose I'm not an expert on AI. I have to admit straight up, even though I've been known to use Grammarly, but that doesn't make me an expert. But what I have spent a great deal of my life thinking about is research integrity and research integrity governance and policies, and how to encourage it, how to incorporate it into research culture, etc., etc. So I'm going to come at this from the perspective of the European Code of Conduct, which was developed by the ALEA Permanent Working Group on Science and Ethics back in 2017 and was revised again in 2023, where we had to think about AI as we were going through. So, Matthias, if you could move on. Yeah, so you can keep going. So basically, I mean, we all, I think, understand that the progress in AI-assisted research that scientists use comes at a cost for research integrity. I mean, Karen has also already mentioned lack of transparency and disclosure, and that is an issue both for researchers, but also for model creators and refiners. We all know, have read about the generation of fictitious clinical trial data, for example, not to say that the generation of synthetic data can't be very useful in research, but if you just simply create fictitious clinical trials, it's not that they haven't been done before AI, but it certainly makes it a lot easier. Data fabrication and falsification, which are some of the key and most important misconducts that have been identified. The paper mills are rubbing their hands in glee, I'm sure, with the advent of AI, because it makes it just so much easier to generate fake papers. We already know that at the moment, at least, many AI tools hallucinate fictitious references. And if you're doing something like a systematic review, that's a really dangerous thing. Text plagiarism, obviously, again, one of the more serious misconducts. And what I came across, somebody was calling it botherships, where basically AI has written the paper for you, and inappropriate applications of statistical models because people haven't asked the right questions of an AI machine. So next slide. So I was thinking then about, well, the European Code of Conduct has set out 4 principles, and how do they hold up if you start thinking about AI-assisted research? So in the European Code of Conduct, we talk about reliability and the quality and the design, the methodology, honesty in developing, reviewing, communicating in a very fair and transparent way, your research work, respecting your colleagues. So this is very much where ethics comes in, but not just your colleagues, participants, subjects, society, and so on. And being accountable for the research, that's very important, from the ideas right through the publication of the results or the use of the results, and thinking about where all of that sits in as a wider societal activity. I really liked 5 principles that Wolfgang Blau and his colleagues set out in a 2024 paper, and the references there for AI use. And actually, they're not that different. So they talk about verification of AI generated content. So being accountable for the accuracy of that data and the imagery and the inferences from the use of AI, transparent disclosure. So that fits very nicely with both honesty and accountability in the European Code. Documentation of the generated data. So again, that's around the reliability, but also the honesty, focusing on ethics and quality. So that fits in very much with the respect piece of the European Code, and then continuous monitoring, oversight, public engagement, etc., which I think also ties with the accountability for the research. So I think basically they're coming at it from slightly different angles, but the principles are essentially the same. So next slide, Matthias, please. So that was the principles in the European Code, but what about the many, many clauses in the European Code? It's only a little document, but it still has many 12 pages of clauses, etc. So it's not that short. But I looked back through all of them to see, you know, how did they reflect AI-assisted research? Would they be of any help to anybody who's thinking of doing this kind of research? And I think the answer is absolutely. So, you know, we talked about the research, sorry, Karen was talking about kind of the environment and GDPR, having appropriate infrastructure for data management and so on. And that allows for accountability. And I meant to say that the principles that were proposed by Brau, etc., he feels that they apply not just to scientists, but also to model creators and refiners in an industry setting. So essentially, he's talking about integrity by design, which we've all heard about ethics by design, but this is very much about integrity by design. And I think that looking at the European Code of Conduct and the different areas that it focuses on, and I'm not going to read through these because the slides will be available afterwards. But what I'm saying is, I think that it's a very good place to start when you're thinking about integrity in AI-assisted research. So Matthias, the final slide, please. Thank you. So I was thinking about, well, what could we do then? Okay, 5 things we could do to mitigate against the negative impacts of AI-assisted research. And we've heard about some, I mean, there are many, many. So I think first and foremost, as with any integrity, you need to enhance the researchers and the developers' awareness of the unacceptable or the unethical uses of AI through education, engagement, and training. I mean, I think that's absolutely key. The development of policies and procedures is incredibly important. And I mean, it's great to see the AI Act now published. But those related to research integrity, actually, I hope I've demonstrated, also apply to the use of AI. So we really do need to promote the fundamentals of research integrity in this kind of research. We definitely should be using the current AI monitoring techniques and tools to safeguard integrity, but we also really need to develop some new ones. And I think we should be keeping the message positive because I think there's a lot of negative narrative out there, but we do have to be pragmatic about it. The Pandora's box is already open. That horse has long left the stables, but we must base our response on the reality for researchers. They are going to use these tools. Of course they are. They'd be crazy not to. So in thinking about how we can mitigate against the negative impacts, we have to accept, I think, that the tools are here to stay, and that perhaps we need to make sure that humans remain at the center of AI-assisted research, deployment, and verification, that it isn't just all handed over. So I will leave it there.
Thank you so much, Maura. Once more, bringing us such a succinct summary of some very, very complex, and you just mentioned 12 pages. So to mention this. I also wanted to thank you for mentioning that you are not an AI expert. I think this transparency is tremendously important. And one of the things that we want to do with this webinar is to really say that AI policy, thinking about AI and asking ourselves what kind of digital world we want to live in, should not just be left to people who are very good at coding or know, the most detailed articles of the AI law. AI will ultimately affect all of us. So thank you so much for being transparent about that and still saying, we still have a voice, we still have to be involved in this. My key takeaways from your talk are that there are, aside from very big benefits, obviously, there are also tremendous risks when it comes to research integrity associated with AI tools. And then when we have to think about the tremendous pressure that many researchers are already under universities, having to get tenure, having to publish in top tier journals, it can be very seductive to commit plagiarism without AI. And now that AI can make things even easier to do so, the seduction has become multidimensional, right? And the tools to obfuscate the cheating, to put it brutally, and other types of scientific misconduct have also become more multidimensional. From what I've heard from you is that you are optimistic, but that we have to keep our eye on the ball, right? Pandora's box is open, but we have to watch the contents of the box and demand better oversight, better accountability. And I hope that also during the webinar, the remaining time, we will also talk about how these things can be enforced, especially because there are obviously loopholes in the various codes, acts and provisions that are existing right now. Thank you so much. Over to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Nausicaa. Thank you everyone who has brought us together. I'm normally based at the University of Vienna. I'm a professor at the Department of Political Science, and I have the great privilege and joy most of the time to chair the European Group on Ethics. The European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies is an independent, multidisciplinary body nominated by the President of the European Commission, by Ursula von der Leyen. And our role is to advise the Commission President and the Commission on all things having to do with the ethics of science and new technologies, understood in a broad sense. And while we have issued a statement also on the ethics of AI, and my role here is not to talk about that today, but really to think with all of you about ethics and integrity in the field of AI in research and science. And I think this is a really, well, first of all, the efforts that my colleagues have presented are very important and very good. It's a really good field also to think about the ethics of AI, because it's not a field where everyone worries about the extinction of humankind. It's not a field where we think about the sort of long-termist consequences, but it's really a field where we see the mundane yet very, very impactful ways in which the development and the proliferation of artificial intelligence changes some practices and also entrenches others. So Karen already mentioned the term power a couple of times, or she spoke to that term rather. And I think power is really key. I think any kind of ethics, and I will get back to that at the end of my short input, any kind of ethics that doesn't think about power in this field doesn't deserve its name. We really need to think about how the development, the use, the infrastructures, the energy, how that is used for AI practices and data-driven practices, how that affects the distribution of power, how certain things are made possible because some actors are more powerful. So in case this is very abstract, let me give you an example. Nausicaa asked us in the beginning, has anyone used, I think you asked about AI, but especially also the use of generative AI is an example of how those of us in privileged world regions, in privileged countries and institutions, we can do our work even more effectively. It saves a lot of time. If you have a subscription to the paid version of generative AI, the hallucinations are relatively moderate compared to others. So access to tools, to AI tools, with the energy and everything else that requires is a privilege. And it is very likely to further asymmetries between those that are already privileged and those that are not, unless we have an ethics that changes that. I haven't even mentioned the intellectual property considerations here, where especially generative AI uses the expertise and effort of some who are not being compensated for the work and also the enrichment of others. And another issue, and I think we don't talk about this enough, is that the idea of efficiency and effectiveness that underpins the use of not only artificial intelligence, but all kinds of technology in research and science. So especially in higher education, in university-based research, an understanding of effectiveness and efficiency that assumes that machines can replace fallible, sort of tired humans and can make workflows more effective are usually a problem. So I'm sure that many of you have already read Lisanne Bainbridge's seminal piece in the 1980s, The Ironies of Automation. If you haven't gotten around reading it, please do, because already in the 1980s, Lisanne Bainbridge warned of some of the mistakes that we're making now. So of course, artificial intelligence can be a wonderful partner for humans in many tasks, but whenever managers, funders, policymakers assume that artificial intelligence can fully replace human beings in complex tasks, that usually goes wrong. And I think in a higher education landscape where the replacement of humans and the overburdening of academics and administrative staff for the sake of cost saving, where that is already rampant, artificial intelligence will be enlisted in that task even more if we're not careful. So my final point is that it's wonderful that there's so much attention to the ethics and the regulation of AI. That's really wonderful, but there's always a but. So I would say that industry also has an interest in funding endowed chairs, in funding research projects on ethics, where of course everyone works very, very independently, as we know. They have an interest in lowercase ethics, as I call it. It's a kind of ethics that makes processes a bit more ethical, but it leaves the political economy untouched. It leaves the distribution of power and agency untouched. So it's this kind of lowercase ethics that is a bit, some call it ethics washing. Karen has written a fantastic chapter on this with colleagues. So I'm not saying that any interest by industry in ethics is ethics washing, but we need to be mindful of that, because what we need at the end of the day is an uppercase ethics, an ethics that asks questions about what kind of society do we want to live in, what is a good life? And especially also in the field of science and research, that's a good place to start where many of us work. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm sure and I hope that we'll come back to the question of power.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for also giving that political and power perspective. As you said, one of the most powerful things I think you just said was that any kind of ethics that doesn't think about power isn't ethics, right? And you also warned us about what also Karen calls ethics washing, you know, so to use ethics, which we've also seen in other marginalized discussions, right? To use it as a bit of a source, right? Oh, we need a sprinkle of gender to this proposal, or we need a sprinkle of ethics. And obviously, when you ask yourself, what is ethics? What kind of ethical questions do we ask? You know, I think the question doesn't just begin with the fact that you need ethics, but also what ethics are. Do we use Western ethics? Do we use globalized ethics? Whose ethics are actually involved? And also what kind of hidden costs has already been there, right? You already hinted at this when it comes to power. So just to think about the tremendous labor, emotional and financial, and the exploitation, financial and emotional, that has been done by data workers all over the world, which is now feeding into all these prime, gorgeous, premium subscriptions that we can use in the West. And also to think about, which was also mentioned in the chat, the environmental costs, right? So any ethics that isn't central and also is asking questions about itself and what ethics are probably shouldn't be called ethics in the first place. So thank you so much for mentioning this as well, that ethics isn't just something that is there for the plucking, right? It is something that needs to be thought through at every stage. Could you also, because we've heard this twice now, and it might be useful for those of the listeners who are not familiar with the term, would you mind briefly explaining the term hallucination? Because intuitively speaking, I think, AI doesn't have a mind, it doesn't have any feelings. So how can it hallucinate?
So if this question was for me, Nazika.
Yes, yes.
We use the term hallucination to refer to things that generative AI makes up that isn't real, in the sense that it isn't an existing source, it isn't an existing fact that can be proved through other means in the world. So for example, if I'm asking, give me 5 references to the ethics of AI in a particular context, and then generative AI would give me 4 references that are actually accurate, and the 5th one is made up. That's what we call hallucination. This is an example of it.
Thank you so much for that explanation. So where it becomes basically impossible, almost impossible to distinguish between something that is reliable and something that isn't, and that it's embedded in something that looks quite trustworthy.
I would say it is possible, but it sort of underscores the need to combine machine work with human expertise and intelligence. So simply using copy and pasting something that generative AI gives me in my own research would be a very, very bad idea.
Thank you so much. So replicability, accountability, and oversight, basically. Thank you so much. I am finally passing the floor to our last speaker, Francis B. Crawley, who has a tremendously long job description. So I will mention the first part. He's a co-chair and coordinator of the COARA Working Group on Ethics and Research Integrity. The floor is yours, Francis.
Thanks so much, Nazika, and it's really nice to be here. What a great panel, and amazing participants as well. I'm going to be very brief because I think we should give some time to the participants as well. So I'm here just on behalf of the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, which is a European-wide initiative on research assessment. I represent ARIP, which is a working group on responsible data and AI in research assessment. So we look mostly at data and AI, but also through the lens of ethics and research integrity. I think, this is my view, but I think research assessment is absolutely key to this whole discussion. This is it. Research is changing dramatically because of the internet, and now even more, I think even more because of AI. So we've really changed the landscape for how science and how academic work is being done. And it's going to go fast and furious in the coming months, not even to speak of years. It's already been going that way. So what is critical is how we appreciate the research that we do and our colleagues do, how we evaluate the value of that research and the impact of that research. And I'm prejudiced. I come from philosophy, so I should be just out in space. But I think societal impact counts. I think it really counts. Are we doing something that affects what people want? In fact, what people are paying us for with their taxes so that we could sit in our universities or in our research centers and do this. Are we doing something impactful? So the question really is how to evaluate that, how to come to those values. If we have a good, rich discussion on the assessment of research in the digital space with regard to data, AI, with regard to other digital technologies, then I think we will come to a better understanding of the role and place of AI in our societies. I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Francis. I really enjoyed the philosopher being off in space comment. Does that also mean that normally there's this idea that philosophers are sort of in their own little world and they don't really think about real world consequences? That
is the claim of my wife and children. But I am trying every day to prove that that's not true. But it's very difficult. Yeah. But thank you for that.
I would love to do another webinar just to hear that. We could get them as panelists. From what I'm taking away from your analysis is that we are basically, by this tremendous acceleration of AI, we are forced to confront quite existential questions in a way, right? Why do we do research? Why do we do research as humans? What is the added value? What is the added value of slow research and fast research, right? So these are quite scary questions. If I think about myself personally as an art historian, I sometimes also wonder, why am I analyzing this painting? You know, what's the point? So these are scary questions. And then you are adding another layer on it. And not just that we have to ask ourselves these scary questions and how they have been redefined by these new tools to which we can delegate a lot of the, so-called menial work of science. But on top of it, you ask, how do we assess the way we are responding to these questions, right? How do we evaluate how we redefine science? So these are various levels of asking ourselves not only what is science in 2026, but also how do we assess whether that is where we want science to go? So these are very, very big and important questions. So thank you so much. We are going to move on to the next part of the debate. And as I mentioned before, I'm an art historian, so I'm moving a little, shall we call it hallucination, into this presentation, which is from a very old movie called The Flying Scotsman, just to use it as a little metaphor. So I did not generate this image, I'm proud to say. So one of the things that we asked ourselves when we were preparing this webinar is, how can we frame the conversation in a way that is relevant for everybody, that isn't too broad, that isn't purely pessimistic, that isn't specialist, but that also has relevance? So one of the things that we ultimately came up with is that we are existing in a time where people are talking a lot about the incredible acceleration of AI, not just within industry, but also the differences between countries. So one of the things that you keep hearing is China and America are far ahead of Europe. How do we keep up? And this creates a metaphor and a way of thinking that AI is a very fast speeding train that goes faster and faster. And like the lady in the slide, we have no choice but to leap on and hold on for dear life. And what we don't see here is that this lady ideally is also holding a huge suitcase. And in this suitcase are ethics, right? So we have to run and jump on the AI train. We have to lug this very weighty, unwieldy luggage of ethics and integrity with us and stay on the train. Because if we don't stay on the train, then it's over. We're going to be left in the middle of nowhere and we're going to disappear, right? So this paradigm of this tremendous acceleration where we have to keep up while still keeping ethics in the back of our mind can obviously cause quite big dangers, because, it is very seductive to cut corners. If you have to get on the train, you might drop some of those luggages just to stay on. So one of the things that we want to do during this webinar is to question whether this idea that we have no choice as researchers, as politicians, as people who are involved in strategy and policy, whether we have no choice but to jump on that speeding train. So the existential question, going back to Francis' existential questions, here's another one. Is there really a speeding train? And do we have no choice but to jump on it? Can we actually think beyond the metaphor of the unstoppable trains? Are there other ways of framing the questions of AI, research integrity, and the urgency that is there beyond this idea of we have no choice, we have to keep up, otherwise Putin is going to govern the world? So how do we move away from doomsday thinking? How do we think about AI and research integrity beyond this paradigm? So my first question to the panel is how we are going to look beyond this unstoppable brain. So are there other ways in which you can take the acceleration of AI seriously, but not see it as a sort of inevitable thing that we have to jump on or be left behind? I'm just going to look at the photo, at the thumbnails that I have of the speakers here. Is there anybody who's really sort of itching to to answer that question? Karen, I see you smiling, so I'm just going to read from the body language through the screen that you might have something to say about this.
Nazca, I could talk all day about and answering this question, and that's why Barbara's smiling, because she's thinking, oh my God, don't let Karen answer that question. So I love the metaphor of the speeding train. And my sense is there's a huge amount of FOMO going on, and that we are presented with this fait accompli, that there's this speeding train. If we don't get on it, we'll be left behind. But nobody's asking, is this train going where I actually want to go? What is the destination? And this comes back to the foundational question that Bara posed is, what is a good life? What is a good digital life? How do we live well with these tools in which they serve us as a people in communities? And that question is not being asked in any of the policy contexts in which I have been a member, and it troubles me deeply that it is all dominated by the technology, the shiny tools that are really great, do great party tricks, but how are they going to serve me and my communities and actually enhance the quality of my life? That question is not being asked in any rigorous and penetrating form. And I absolutely would like to see the question being shifted to where it is that we want to go and how do we want to live with these tools that are here to stay and that can do fantastic things, but they have a lot of serious shortcomings and we need to learn how to live well with them and work out where we want to go. So that's my 2 cents.
Barbara, I can see you nodding. You and Karen already know each other. Can we, in a sense, afford to slow down and to wait for another train? Can we afford to do this?
So my first response to this would be to say AI is not a train. It's not something that goes from A to B and that is a sort of product going on rails that somebody else put up. It's still in the making. I'm looking for a good metaphor, and if anyone in this virtual room has one, help us. I can't think of a good metaphor. I'm thinking it's in a way a garden where we're supposed to make something grow, but maybe that's a bit too organic as a metaphor. If AI were a train, then I think a good way to think about it would be, again, in terms of the political economy, about privatization. So somebody put down the rails. It's probably comes from public money. Somebody trained the AI experts. Someone developed a schedule. When should the train go to where to serve what population? And then at some point, it's either sort of privatized, where then it serves for profit motives and where the schedule is adjusted so that it's profitable and it no longer primarily serves communities. And well, we could expand that metaphor in this direction. So maybe in that sense, AI, the train is a good metaphor for AI. It's a public infrastructure. It's maybe something that we all need. So how can we exercise meaningful democratic control and of course allow innovation and of course allow commercial activity? So that's all good. But how can we bring it together in a sense that in a way that it creates public value?
Thank you so much, Barbara. I love the image of the rails not having been fully laid yet, so that you're also questioning this idea of absolute inevitability. And your invitation to think about metaphors together. So I'm also looking at the Q&A right now, and I see some other metaphors coming up. So you also mentioned a garden, which I understand can be a bit ironic considering the huge environmental costs of AI and how much it even costs to just generate one funny image. I also see that there's a comment in saying there is no train at all. Somebody else has mentioned electricity, something that we cannot do without, but which is everywhere, but that we can also turn off or route or use in different ways. Frances, as a philosopher, and to just take you briefly back into space, to think completely hypothetically, is such a metaphor even relevant? Why do we even have to talk about metaphors when it comes to AI? Is this just us being sort of, indulgent as academics talking about metaphors and what metaphor is suitable for AI? Or is there actually a reason to think or not think about AI as a train or as something else?
I'm willing to answer, but you have to promise not to tell my family that I'm saying this, okay? But it is a philosophical question, I think. And I think it is a question about the good life and how we want to live. I think that's what the fundamental question is. I don't think AI is about AI in the first place. I think it's about us. I think that's the real question of AI. That's why everybody's so interested in it, because it's all about us. It's a question of what it means to be human. Now, we have a lot of ways we can define being human, but one of the ways we've always thought of ourselves as being human was that we're rational, and that we are the rational animal inhabiting this beautiful planet called Earth. And with regard to science and academics, we always thought, well, it's human beings who are the smart ones out there. So what happens when we start to see that, I start to see, because you asked me before, did I use AI this morning? I admitted to doing it, because I find sometimes the AI is smarter than I am. I have to admit, I mean, not have to admit it, it's easy to admit because it's just the case. It knows more than I know, and I can learn a lot from it, and I can use it. But then what does that mean someday when the next Nobel Prize in literature comes from a book written by AI? Can we live with that? That's the question, because what does it mean then? Who am I then if AI is smarter than me? Or who are we as people? And how do we then look at our lives and look at what the good life is? Don't tell anybody.
Thank you so much. So, Francis, basically what you're saying, also adding to the existential questions that we have to confront when it comes to who are we as scientists, comes another even more existential question: who are we as humans, and how is our own idea of who we are as humans changing because of AI, both as rational beings and as the smartest beings? So, Maura, may I ask you, are there alternatives to thinking about the accelerating development of AI, which you also called Pandora's box, which is already open, that are beyond this sort of inevitability of having to run and cut corners and catch up with this moving train? Are there other ways of framing the AI conundrum?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, we talked about this a little bit when I was chatting to you earlier, that AI is not a way of life. It is a tool or a set of tools that, and yes, I would slightly disagree with Francis in that he says it's smarter than him. It's certainly faster than him. And, you know, when it comes to huge data sets, I mean, of course it is, and if it finally can get it, you know, if the developers can get reliable AI, it would be a lot quicker to do a systematic review using AI tools than it would be for you and I to sit down and go through all of the hoo-ha. So I think it's definitely can do things more quickly than we can. Possibly not more accurately at the moment, but definitely more quickly. So I think then we have to think, well, okay, if we have that kind of tool available to us, that's amazing. That's fantastic, because that then frees us as humans to consider how to use this data and how to ensure that the research that comes out of this, the outputs, can actually have benefit more broadly. And I mean, if you go right back to the fundamentals, the principles in the European Code of Conduct, one of the things it talks about is having respect for colleagues, for participants, but for culture, for society, for the environment, for heritage. And, you know, that principle still applies, I believe. So in using these tools, which hopefully will get better and more accurate as time goes on, I think we, as the developers of, the refiners of, the users of these tools, it is our responsibility then to make sure that whatever comes out of that use is used responsibly. So it doesn't really matter how fast the train is going. It's the people who are holding onto those rails that are the important piece.
So if I understand you correctly, Maura, you're also saying that even if there is a speeding train that accelerates, it doesn't mean that we have to jump on it right away, right? By dropping the luggage of ethics. So I'm moving over to you, Barbara, in our preparation question. On the 29th of August, we had a preparatory webinar with just the speakers. And you mentioned that one of the things that you find very troublesome is that ethics and development are very often pitted against each other, right? So sometimes ethics is this little source that people have to sort of tick off their checklist, or they are something that are always, something that slow things down, right? So you basically said we have to think about ethics differently and not as something that is the opposite of development or the opposite of excellence in AI. Could you comment a little bit more on this?
That's not entirely correct. I talked about ethics and regulation, not ethics and development. So
right,
something that is happening in some contexts, in some circles, is that, and especially when industry representation is very pronounced, is that the argument is made that if we get the ethics right, then we don't need regulation. And I think that's a very dangerous argument for two reasons. First, because it's a kind of category mistake, or it's a kind of a problematic statement that assumes that ethics and regulation can do without each other. Clearly, they cannot, because ethics without regulation is totally toothless, and regulation without ethics is soulless. So they need each other. But it's also a problem because it very often pushes in the direction of self-regulation, suggesting that, leave the experts, meaning industry, leave them to regulate themselves. They are the only ones who understand. It's a little bit like the economy, right? The economy can only be understood by experts. And, you and I and the citizens cannot understand anything about it, so best stay clear. So, and if ethics is used in this way, to argue that we don't need regulation, I think then it's a problem. So, of course, regulation needs to be good. Of course, it shouldn't be overzealous. But good regulation does not, as it's sometimes claimed, stifle innovation. I mean, overzealous and bad regulation stifles innovation, but good regulation is also good for the technology developers, public and private, because it allows them to plan ahead. It tells them exactly what they can do and what they cannot do. So we need good regulation on the foundation of good ethics and values, and to play out ethics and regulation against each other is in the best case naive, and in the worst case
I think, has Barbara frozen, or is she just frozen on my screen? I think she will unfreeze in a minute. Thank you so much for clarifying that, Barbara, and also to clarify the difference between development and regulation. I also see here in the chat that ethics and regulation are the basis to ensure, technology to develop well, where they need each other to not be heartless and soulless, as you just mentioned, Barbara. Now, nevertheless, Karen, if I may ask you, there are various loopholes in the current AI regulation. The EU AI Act will have tremendous repercussions around the world, holding companies far outside Europe accountable to more stringent regulation. At the same time, as was also mentioned in the introduction, there are loopholes for companies, right, who do not meet a certain threshold. They are not classified as high risk, and they can self-assess, which makes it very seductive to apply as few ethics and as little regulation as possible. Could you explain to us what the benefit would be to a very commercial company who is under tremendous pressure of their shareholders, who want to move fast and break things? What would their benefit be from implementing both ethics and, as Barbara so importantly said, regulation as a core principle?
Well, that's a really good question, which really comes down to why should we obey the law? I don't really hopefully need to answer that. And this is part of what really frustrates me about the demonization of regulation, or if we just replace it with the word law. Without law, there is no freedom, because there is no security, and we would instead be in the jungle, okay? Because it would be ruled by force. And people keep forgetting that the law provides the framework upon which strangers can cooperate peacefully, and that we have an institutional system that is backed by the coercive power of the law to hold people responsible for their other regarding actions. That is the entire foundation of the law. It's not primarily about justice, it's primarily about peaceful cooperation. That always comes as a surprise to law students. But this is why We need regulation to lay the foundations upon which we can peacefully cooperate and advance for the benefit of the community in a democratic manner. It's that simple, and somehow the narrative has been completely perverted. So I have a rant about this. I can place it in the chat if anybody is interested in reading my rant. I'll send it there.
Can we have a sneak preview of the rant?
Yeah, sure.
We are human-centered after all.
Here's the rant. When I just got so sick of listening to this nonsense about regulation stifling innovation, I thought, you know what? I'm done. I'm actually going to have a very public rant about all of this nonsense, and you can read it here. So enjoy.
Amazing, thank you. And that's very efficient. Like, here's a link to my rant. I love that. I wish I could do that in my private life. It's like, I'm not even going to explain, just read it on Substack. So you're saying, obviously, that, you know, we have to think of regulation not in this sort of abstract way, but these are the laws. These are the things that ultimately give us freedom, right? This whole idea of where one person's freedom ends, the other person's begin, and vice versa. To play a bit of devil's advocate here, say I am, you know, I have a startup and I've identified a loophole in the law and in the regulation. I'm like, well, why should I be stupid and be like, you know, the goody two shoes and, you know, go bust when all the other companies are not sticking to regulations either and trying to find the best loopholes? What benefit would I have as somebody who has a startup and very little money and is very ambitious? What benefits do I have from regulation and to not be, you know, the cannon fodder of other people just avoiding it in a free market economy?
Yeah, well, so then you have the curse of capitalism and you get no rational benefit, but perhaps you can sleep better at night. That's all I can say now. So I'm afraid that within a capitalist economy, the incentives are for the quickest and the fastest, and not necessarily for those who are most responsible. And so that's why we need to close those loopholes. But in the meantime, people are free to exploit those gaps. That's just the way the system works. I'm not defending it. It's just the way the system works.
Does any one of the panelists have an idea about other incentives that may not exist right now, but might be created? I see Sue hands being raised. Maura, would you mind starting?
Sure. I mean, I think just listening to Karen there, it brought to mind a little bit for me the greening of industry. So, you know, okay, depending on how cynical you are, you can say, well, industry isn't really getting all that green, but they are making an effort. And they're making an effort essentially because they see a profit opportunity, because they feel that they will be perceived more favorably by the consumers of their products if they can demonstrate that they're doing things more sustainably, etc., etc. And I'm just wondering, for AI development, is there a sort of a public pressure that could be brought to bear, that be that people are saying, you know, we don't want AI to take over our lives. What are you going to do about this? Where is, I guess we need a public debate about this almost, but then they have to be aware about what the dangers could be, what the possible solutions could be in order to have that debate. But maybe we'll have an AIing of industry. I don't know how you'd even describe that, but something similar to the greening of industry in the future. That'd be kind of cool.
So basically a sort of green capitalism or an alternative version that everybody benefits
Yeah,
from.
well, I mean, let's face it, it's still profit driven. That's the motivation, you know, so that feeds into the capitalist narrative. But it's been, the profit now is coming also from public perception. So it's a little bit different to just producing, you know, something that's a nicer color, like iPhones, whatever. But I think that's going to require public debate and public pressure.
Right, so public debate and public pressure to reframe what effective capitalism is, what kind of incentives there are. So even if you do not want to overthrow the entire system, how within that system we can also rethink the idea of profit and what it's based on, right? And to think about it more sustainably when we think about AI more sustainably. Barbara, you also wanted to comment on this.
I wanted to comment on your earlier question. But I think there's a very nice connection to the very important point that you mentioned, Maura. So Nausicaa, your question about the startup company, how can the startup company benefit from regulation? And I think here I'm a bit more optimistic than Karen. I think it can, because regulation is not, it's not only red tape, it can be enabling. Let's also think about antitrust. So it can protect smaller businesses from monopolization. Regulation is also corporate welfare. So subsidies, concessions, everything that sort of benefits business opportunities is also part of regulation. So if we get regulation right, then the enterprises with good ideas can benefit more than the ones who just squeeze everyone, and go in the gray areas of the law to create and maximize profits. And I think herein lies maybe also a response to your question, Maura. I mean, regulation could give the right incentives. It could give incentives to measuring value in a different way. It could also give incentives for certain practices to be taxed differently, or to be rewarded differently. So all of those things are things that regulation can do. So I think one important thing that we all need to do is to stop thinking about regulation only as red tape. It can be that, but it's much, much, much more.
Thank you so much. So again, it is about rethinking and reframing what is regulation, what are ethics, right? Going back to the most fundamental questions. And also, as Frances said earlier, going back to the fundamental questions, what makes us human and also what makes us researchers. So circling back to that and leaving the hypothetical startup behind and going back to the question of, researchers, what kind of incentives are there for the ambitious but overworked, precarious researchers? You've also, it's already been mentioned before that one of the huge problems that universities face right now is that a lot of the really big talent is being creamed off, so to say, by industry that's, lure them in with a lot more money, a lot more computational power, et cetera, et cetera. So what kind of incentives are there for researchers to really practice ethical AI and to rethink and reshape what ethical AI actually means? What kind of incentives are there for those people also on an individual and also on a single institutional level? Is there anybody who's itching to respond to that question?
I'm happy to say something about that.
Thank you.
I want to go back to the regulation and then I'll come to this. I think they're related. I've written a lot of codes and a lot of guidelines in Europe and internationally, and also worked on a lot of legislation in Europe and other countries. Socrates says the law teaches, and I've always believed that. The law teaches, and we should learn from the law. So the law is not just about forbidding or putting up limits to activities. The law shows us pathways, how we can go through society through a good conduct. And I think when we talk about incentives, the very first place we should start is with research integrity. And that is, those incentives need to come from within in the first place. They cannot only come from without. So when we often think of incentives as, we'll get a reward from something, we'll get a cup, we'll get a watch, we'll get some money, or we'll get a new job or promotion or something like that. Those are real incentives, and we need to consider those, especially in the context of research assessment. But in the very first place, we need to consider the incentives that we give to ourselves. Those are the fundamental ones.
So what you're basically saying is that those fundamental questions, those scary questions, will ultimately make us better researchers, and that the law is not just something that is, like an electric fence that pushes us back the moment we overstep, but rather something that will prod us and prompt us, sorry to use AI language, to think about what we are and what we do as scientists better, right? To create something that is more sustainable. Maura?
I actually, it's just to kind of almost follow on from what Francis is saying, because he raises the really important issue of incentives and reward, and which brings us right back to research assessment. So what is it that we value as researchers, and what is valued about us by our institutions? And until we change that, until we think much more, give much more value to people who are really trying to do the research in a good way, in an ethical way, in a rigorous and repeatable way, until those are the things we really, really value, as opposed to how many papers you have in a high impact journal, how many citations, etc., etc. It's going to be very hard to change how people work. But thankfully, and through the good offices of Francis and his team in Quara, this is happening. It is happening already. So, you know, as I say, I think AI is a tool. It's another tool that researchers use. And so if you're going to award people or reward people for good research, then it becomes part of that narrative.
Thank you so much. So that's basically that you are talking about that even if we want to incentivize people at an individual level, we need to create the structural framework that rewards ethical work, right? That sees the value of sustainable work. And we've seen this on a policy level in various European countries, also with the DORA initiative, which ultimately tries to reward slow science, different scientific outputs, and to go beyond a sort of metric-based system, which has also turned us into slightly human research machines, right? Little factories that keep churning out papers that have a good impact factor, and moving away from that, right? This machine-like production, and to incentivize people to create something that creates a different type of value. And of course, for that, you do need structural incentives, because if that ultimately is going to mean that your position is not going to be extended, or you're not going to receive funding, then that's going to be very difficult, right? You're going to be fighting against windmills. So one of the things that I also would like to ask the panel before we open up for the Q&A is the fact that of complicity. I think it is going to be difficult to ignore that a lot of the AI tools that we're using right now, even if we use them as ethically and as innocently as possible, have come, and that ship has already sailed, at tremendous environmental and human cost. Just to think about the labor exploitation, particularly outside of Europe, but also within Europe, of people being placed on medium contracts of 3 days, of having to work tremendously hard, of being put under horrific pressure, and also having to view really horrible content, of being indirectly implicated in warfare, in their, so supposedly innocent categorizing of data being used for horrific means. And the tools that we use have that in them, not to mention the environmental footprint. So one of these things that can happen, if you couple that tremendous ethical stain on AI, and if you couple that with the speeding train, and if you couple that with the doom scenario that is so popular in culture, right? This idea of the supercomputers, turning us into cockroaches and us becoming sort of the minions of some super intelligence, which I know is a fictitious scenario, but it is very attractive and it's quite prevalent. Coupled with all of that, it can lead to a sense of saturation and exhaustion, and thinking, well, it's all so terrible, I don't know, I'm just going to use DeepL, okay, guys, just leave me alone. So how can we empower researchers and the people who are here right now to improve things, both at an individual level and more structurally? And I'm also specifically talking about people who feel like they do not know AI that well. I'm going back again to what Maura said so explicitly. I think you're a fantastic example of somebody who's not, who says this about herself, but you're still involved in the policy making. So how can we, empower the proverbial postdoc in, I don't know, musicology, who's in the archive all day and has 3 months left on their contract and has no idea what's going to happen? How can we empower them to feel that they can also co-shape AI integrity and ethics, especially considering that enormous load, that ethical load, that stain that already exists on AI? Karen, may I ask you what your feeling would be about this, since we already heard your rant? That's a tough question. I'm so sorry, but since you ranted already, I thought we're comfortable here. Yeah.
I think the situation of an individual researcher is really, it's relatively disempowered, I have to say, because I think that the structural incentives are so profound that it's very, very hard to swim against the tide, particularly if you're a junior researcher, and that really troubles me. I think the incentives for the speed of publication and the number of papers is genuinely pernicious, because it means that we don't actually reward and incentivize the really hard, deep, serious, meaningful cross-disciplinary research that needs to be done to solve real-world social problems. And the problem, we could solve the problem of malnutrition. We don't need AI to do that. What we need is political commitment and will. Forget the AI. But you'd be mistaken for believing, you'd be forgiven for believing that AI will solve this, because AI is being portrayed as solving all of these great grand societal challenges. But the problem is not the mathematical solution. The problem is the people. But it's also true in our academic institutions. The incentive structures are such that if you want to survive and to make your way up the ladder, there are certain things that are expected of you, and you have relatively little power when you're at the bottom of the food chain to do very much about it, I'm afraid. So, I mean, I have to say that when I started out, the academic environment was completely different. But I mean, I spent 20 years in the wilderness where people thought what I did was just nuts. That's that crazy woman in some law school doing this weird research on technology. And then the phone started ringing, slowly and then very, very quickly. But I had to really believe in the value and importance of what I was researching, and not pick the low-hanging fruit. And that's a really hard road to hoe. And so leadership really matters. Leadership really matters to change the culture, to change the incentives, and to take our researchers seriously. I do think that's what we need, because we've just got a hamster wheel going, and it's just getting faster. And I'll be really honest with you, I'm somewhat circumspect when I'm advising my young researchers about their future careers. It's not what it was 30 years ago, and now I'm sounding like a grandma, but it's true. It's true. Over to you.
It comes all back to what Frances said, right? The fundamental questions of what it means to be a scientist are completely redrafted, and nobody could expect of you to predict the future when nobody can, right? In the field of AI. So we have a bit of a, for Karen, your solution ultimately would not be at the individual level, but at the structural and leadership level. Nevertheless, is there any way that people who are not at the leadership level can right now, tomorrow, do something to demand improvement?
Could I add just one point to what Karen said? I think it's brilliant. I think, it's really important, and it's nice to write guidelines and laws and be involved in this kind of discussion. But nothing surpasses education. Nothing surpasses education. And without education, all the rest it doesn't work. So, and we have to value education now in this AI field, in this digital field. We have to, and Karen, you're right, we have to learn how to do education anew. So the question of research assessment is also a question about how we educate people in the future. This is a critical thing here. But we should never put, there's nothing a professor or a teacher does above teaching. It doesn't go beyond that.
So this is something that people could do right away, right? To open these debates in the classroom. Sometimes as teachers, I tend to forget that as well. We tend to think that our students are going to be young forever, but in 5 to 10 years, they might be at really crucial positions, right? So that's something to be really mindful of. They might work in industry, they might work at a policy level. Barbara, you obviously spend a lot of time working on power. And now I would like to ask you something about empowerment. Sorry about the very cheesy pun. Is there any way that we can empower researchers right now to demand and change and reflect on the ethics of AI?
I think this is not the right question to ask, because, well, no, let me put it differently. We could empower researchers, but it has to go through the institute. It has to involve the institutions. So I fully support what both Frances and Karen said. And this doesn't mean that we assume that individual researchers have no responsibility or no agency at all. But institutions that signal, and very often this is different from what they say, but nevertheless they reward outputs that are based on fast science in the bad sense of the word. So of course there can also be good science that's fast, but fast science, sort of sloppy, fast, low-hanging fruit. As long as institutions do that, the rhetoric of empowering researchers will remain empty. And then you will have those researchers who are sort of privileged because they have an alternative career that they can pursue if it doesn't go right, or they have better contracts than others. So those can then be the ethical ones, and all the other ones will have to compromise. They will have to use the tools that consume a lot of energy. They will have to use the tools that hallucinate and take the risk that they get something wrong. So I think the question of empowerment has to go through the institutions, and not only the universities and research institutions, but also the funders and ultimately policymakers at the national and supranational levels. So they need to help research institutions give the right incentives, and especially funders can do a lot. They can say that, for example, they can give conditions to research funding that they give to universities only if they meet certain criteria. It has been done. Think of the Charter Mark in the UK, Athena's One, and so on. So there are lots of templates for that. That is the best empowerment, an empowerment that is that has equity in mind and that includes the institutions and the individual research.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the questions that we're asking here are almost the questions of, can you even ask an individual to do this? And then the question is, which individual, as you rightly said, right? So which individuals will ultimately feel confident enough and say, okay, I'm going to see that microphone, right? I'm going to take that platform. I also saw a comment in the chat about somebody saying, why don't we create more community-based research, right? Where knowledge, rather than being siloed and guarded jealously for ourselves, is shared, to go out of this competitive techno-nationalist mindset and to go more for a, sharing approach, which I think young researchers often tend to think that they only have to adhere to the system that exists. But young researchers are ultimately the future, right? And they are allowed and they can take initiatives such as community-based work that may not harm their career, but which still creates a different template, a different mindset. Finally, I think I also see a connection between what Frances said and what you said, Barbara, about this idea of education on the one hand, Frances, what you said, and Barbara, what you said about cordoning something off as expertise. One of the issues of AI is that it's becoming increasingly a sort of field where people feel like they don't understand it and they have to leave it to the experts. I think what Frances has said, this idea of empowerment, that everybody is allowed to talk and demystify AI and therefore make it accessible, is tremendously important. And yes, we shouldn't be too optimistic, and we have to think about what empowerment means. But I am very excited about this idea of community-based research. Barbara, to leave the final comment to you, if that's what you're comfortable with, before we open the final teeny tiny Q&A. Do you see a solution as sort of more community-based approaches in research?
Oh, absolutely. So I think this might not work everywhere and for everyone, but where it works, and we've seen this also in publishing, Diamond Open Access is one example. So Diamond Open Access means that nobody's charged, that scholars get together and do something because they believe in it. So commoning, so creating commons and community-based research is, I think, if I had to choose one approach to doing this that probably needs to be supported the most and is discussed the least, it's that. So we talk about other good measures such as incentives through research funders and so on, but really enabling, and this also means financially enabling community-based problem solving that includes science and research, that is a very underexplored route, I think. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. So the idea of the funding route, so I'm not thinking just purely about institutions, governments and industry, but also about funders, right? This other important agent in this research landscape. I'm also adding that from one of the questions from the Q&A, which actually asks us, are research funders doing enough to encourage researchers to use AI responsibly? I think I'm sort of looking at Maura here. Would you say that funders are doing enough to reward this?
Probably. I don't. I mean, just looking at Science Europe, which is a collaboration of funders, have recently put out a report about AI and research integrity and so on. So it is certainly something that funders are thinking about. Whether they are being specific in their conditions of funding about the responsible use of any tool or technology, not really. But what they are being much more specific about now is that people are adhering to good research practices, and that the institutions that they fund have those policies and processes in place. And a lot of those are actually based on the European Code of Conduct, but there you go. So my question would be, do the funders need to specifically talk about AI, or do they need to talk about the fundamentals of good research, responsible research, ethical research, research that takes into account societal impact? I mean, you know, I'm just thinking, when I was doing my PhD, I was using PCR, polymerase chain reaction. Was brand new at the time. People were just figuring out how it worked and so on. So I mean, it was a big thing, and you know, it was like the eighth wonder of the world when we got a PCR machine in the lab, and everybody had to come in and have a look at it. And during COVID, we had PCR testing to say whether you were positive or negative, and people thought nothing of it. They didn't know what it was, but you know, they knew what it did in their lives. It allowed them to go to that wedding, to travel, to have to stay at home for 10 days or whatever. And they trusted that the research that had produced that test was robust, was reliable, was repeatable. They trusted in the science, in other words. And I think you could say the same for AI. People need to trust that it is being applied, developed, and used in an honest and accountable, a trustworthy way. They don't actually need to understand AI at all. You know, so I think the funders, again, don't really have to specify AI as a tool, but they do need to specify that people are doing the research in a way that produces reliable, robust, accountable, honest results.
Going back to those existential questions again, right? What makes science and what makes good science?
Back to basics, yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to, finally, we are on machine time here. For the last minute, I would like all of you to just leave us with one final sentence. If you were almighty for a day, what would be the first thing when it comes to ethics, AI, and research integrity? So I know this is I'm being very annoying to ask you at the very last minute just to digest it into one sentence. But if there's one thing you could do, a genie appears out of a bottle, and you can ask the genie to at least do one thing when it comes to art, research, AI, research, and integrity, what would it be? Barbara, may I ask you first?
Create jointly publicly owned tools that don't exploit anyone, and that can be used by everyone.
Thank you so much. Francis?
Agree with Barbara. And there's a question that's in the chat that couldn't be put into the questions. I think it's a really good question from Tony Royce Hallower. what if people don't have access to AI? What does that mean for them as researchers? What if they don't have the access to this digital space? What does it mean? I think it's a critical question. I said before, research integrity begins with us, with me, ourselves. But it also begins in the terms of Emmanuel Levinas, with the other, starting with the face of the other, starting there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Karen.
I'm finding this one really hard, but just riffing off Francis's comment, there's an awful lot of important research that asks questions about human meaning, and the machines cannot answer that. And let us not forget that this is some of the most powerful research that we could undertake. So in the quest to grasp the shiny new tools, let's not forget the kinds of questions that really matter and the kinds of questions we should be investigating with or without tools, but with our minds and with our understanding.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Maura, your wish.
Oh, my wish. Well, as I say, you know, the horse has well and truly bolted out of the stable. So, I mean, I really would wish that the developers and the creators and the refiners of AI sort of, you know, tools and the background data and so on, that somehow or other they would wake up one morning and think, gosh, we really need to do this as integrity or ethics by design, that they would just simply think, yeah, that's the way we need to go. But that's, I'm living in cloud cuckoo land there, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much to all speakers. I think we need that optimism and the naivete in a way, because that's how ultimately change is born. You know, it is not always born from cynicism. We have to maybe be a bit blue-eyed about it and also trust that sustainable and ethical solutions can go hand in hand with the bolted horse, the fast-moving train, the garden, and, you know, the very dodgy roots of some of the AI applications that we're seeing right now. I would like to thank all of the speakers, as well as Sapea, Cora, Erip, and Alea, for this wonderful webinar, for putting all of us together. It has been tremendously enriching for me to hear all of your perspectives. I hope that this has been relevant both for the people who are stakeholders in this debate, as well as those of you who are new to the AI debate. Everything will be published online, so you'll be able to look back at the things that we've been discussing just now. And obviously, any questions or comments, a lot of us will be available on you know, the cesspool that is social media or email. Thank you so much. I don't know, Matthijs or Stephanie, would you like to add anything? Otherwise, we are probably going to close the meeting.
Thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a lovely day.
I'm staying just in case there was some last minute